Strength and honor.
Strength and honor.
Theodore Roosevelt once said, "The credit belongs to the man who is actually in the arena."
I believe there's a hero in all of us that keeps us honest, gives us strength, makes us noble.
So that his place shall never be with those cold and timid souls who know neither victory nor defeat.
Seize the day.
Whose face is marred by dust and sweat and blood. Who knows the great enthusiasms, the great devotions, and spends himself in a worthy cause.
And I'm gonna stay right here and fight for this lost cause.
You've got to get mad.
I mean plumb mad dog mean.
Our deepest fear is not that we are inadequate. Our deepest fear is that we are powerful beyond measure.
Who at best, if he wins, knows the thrills of high achievement. And if he fails, at least fails while daring greatly.
I'm gonna show you how great I am.
Shortly after taking off from Jakarta last October, a Lion Air Boeing 737 MAX started to behave erratically. Pilots flipped through their manual, trying to figure out how to regain control of the aircraft. But the manual would be of little help. The brand new airplane crashed in the Java Sea, killing all 189 passengers and crew. Investigators suspect a new automated system on board, called MCAS, may have contributed to the tragedy. The system is designed to force the plane to pitch down if it thinks the aircraft is about to stall. But in the Lion Air case, a faulty sensor gave the wrong signal, prompting the MCAS system to kick in repeatedly, countering the pilot's efforts to bring the nose back up.
Hi once again, everybody. I'm Ed Berliner. Welcome to this episode of The Man in the Arena. Thank you so much for joining us. We start out, unfortunately, on a somber note, because Lion Air on October 29th, 2018, crashed into the Java Sea. 189 souls were lost, and they were flying a 737 MAX 8. This is information that everyone knows. An Ethiopian Airlines flight, March 10th, 2019, a 737 MAX 8, 157 people dead. That's 346 people who passed away on the same type of aircraft, which had people asking, why suddenly are these aircraft, some of the most technologically advanced aircraft in the world, crashing? And should we be concerned? Should the American public and anybody who flies now be concerned about flying a certain aircraft? Because here's the questions, so many of them actually. Could it have been pilot error? Could there have been missing words in a manual? Could there have been equipment failure? Or was it a manufacturer that was so greedy that they simply didn't pay attention to the warning signs and it cost people their lives? We're going to get some insight right now and hopefully answer some of these questions. My guest is a preeminent individual in his field and talking about aircraft and what happens in the skies. He is the CEO of Aero Consulting Experts. He has 53 years and 33,000 plus hours of worldwide heavy jet operation and training. He is a former flight captain trainer for Boeing, and he has 40 plus years in the air for United and other commercial airlines. It is a pleasure to welcome Ross Aimer to the show and to discuss more of what happens here on The Man in the Arena. Ross, thank you so much for being here.
Pleasure, sir.
Ross, it is a shame that we have to start out looking at those kind of numbers. But before we get into a lot of the technical issues that are involved here, and again, I asked a lot of questions, which hopefully we're going to cover here. You, as somebody who has been aboard so many aircraft in your time, not the second aircraft, but when you heard of the first aircraft, the Lion Air crash, what were the questions that immediately popped into your mind, knowing that this was a brand new type of aircraft?
Obviously, as someone who knows about some of these low-cost carriers like Lion Air that are kind of popping out everywhere around the world with the explosive growth of civil aviation, the first thing that came into my mind was, oh, shocks. Lion Air does not have a very good safety track record. Perhaps it was a problem with their operation side, perhaps pilot error. That was the first thing that came into mind. And then we obviously, I try not to make any judgment right away, because every time within the next 24 hours, 48 hours after a crash, whatever we say sometimes turns out to be completely wrong. So I did not make any comment and waited to hear some more about the actual crash.
Now, you talked about some of the low-cost airlines, and I know that that has been a bone of contention with many aviation experts around the world. There are, and as a matter of fact, I know that you've commented on it as well. Should we simply be looking at, and we're going to get again to a lot of those questions, but when we look at carriers like Lion Air, I have been concerned about getting on some of these aircraft before. Here in America, there is an airline, Spirit Airline, which I know people who would rather walk. If they live in Miami and have to get to San Clemente, they'd rather walk than get on this airline because they are scared spitless that something is not going to be right. Do we need to be overly concerned not just with the aircraft, but with the maintenance of the aircraft and with those who are on board the aircraft to help people in case of an emergency?
Look, at majority of operational costs of an airline are identical. You pay a certain amount of money for an aircraft to purchase from Boeing, from Airbus, from Embraer. You pay basically the same amount for gas, parts, airport fees, or whatnot. So my contention with these LCCs, low-cost carriers, are they have to make up for it somewhere where everybody else pays the same. Guess what? It's training, maintenance, and labor costs. That's where they take the money out of, obviously, service. And you mentioned Spirit. Anyone who's been on that aircraft, on that airline, is complaining. Yet they get on it because it's cheaper. You get what you pay for.
So do we need to do more research into these low-cost carriers? Do we need to pay more attention to people like you? And does the media, the legitimate media, need to launch more investigations into what happens not just at the ground level here, Ross, but at the corporate level, where this money is then decided what we're going to spend and when we're going to spend it, and how much profit we're going to make over how safe we're going to make our aircrafts?
Absolutely. You know, 100 years ago, when Bill Boeing set up a little storefront in Seattle and called it Boeing Aircraft, it wasn't the same name in the beginning, but eventually became Boeing Aircraft, out of a little storefront. His idea, he was a romantic. He was an aviation romantic. His idea was to make something that is the safest he could, and he could sell that, and not just to make money, but make something for himself and people around him. Unfortunately, we have deviated from that almost 100 years ago, where nowadays I have to sadly say, I think Boeing is only the last few years was thinking of profits and nothing else. You always hear safety is our #1 concern, but the more I hear that, the more I'm convinced it is true. Safety is their #1 concern, unless if it costs a penny.
I want to bring that up because we mentioned Boeing here. Let's hear from the CEO, because after the accidents, Boeing's public relations firm and their in-house PR firm immediately gets out their CEO, puts him on video, and has him create what I call the apology tour, which is natural and which the media picks up on. Here's exactly what the CEO said in regard to these accidents.
We at Boeing are sorry for the lives lost in the recent 737 MAX accidents. These tragedies continue to weigh heavily on our hearts and minds, and we extend our sympathies to the loved ones of the passengers and crew on board Lion Air Flight 610 and Ethiopian Airlines Flight 302. All of us feel the immense gravity of these events across our company and recognize the devastation to the families and friends of the loved ones who perished. The full details of what happened in these two accidents will be issued by the government authorities in the final reports. But with the release of the preliminary report of the Ethiopian Airlines Flight 302 accident investigation, it's apparent that in both flights, the Maneuvering Characteristics Augmentation System, known as MCAS, activated in response to erroneous angle of attack information. The history of our industry shows most accidents are caused by a chain of events. This again is the case here. And we know we can break one of those chain links in these two accidents. As pilots have told us, erroneous activation of the MCAS function can add to what is already a high workload environment. It's our responsibility to eliminate this risk. We own it, and we know how to do it.
Is it not factual then in this case, or at least something that we need to look at, that if you're going to discuss a chain of events, it starts and ends with the people at Boeing, because they are the ones who then decide the maintenance. They decide the maintenance schedules. They decide the unions, and we're going to talk about unions here as well, because the union plant's been moved to South Carolina simply because the unions are not as strong in South Carolina, and they can take advantage of the workers there and pay them a whole lot less money. So when we hear the CEO tell us that we know there's a chain of events, and he starts talking to us about technological issues like MCAS, should we not look him square in the eye and say, you knew this was going to happen. You saw an aircraft go down. You saw over 100 people die, and you didn't do anything about it because months later, the same damn thing happened. Isn't it about time we got to get angry and tell them that you are part of the chain of events and you just haven't done a damn thing?
Absolutely, Ed. Did you see the sincerity just oozing out of that face when he was saying he is sorry? No, he's not sorry. But this is not the first aircraft that Boeing has come out with. They know how to make good airplanes. I flew those airplanes for 40 years in airline service. Every one of them, they were great airplanes. They were safe airplanes. Yes, occasionally we had hiccups, teething problems, but there's no teething problem with 737. It's a 60-year aircraft design. They just keep adding to it. And for him to say MCAS was the cause, I completely agree with you. No, Boeing was the cause of these accidents and their greed.
I mentioned the fact that in South Carolina, the unions are basically less effective there than they were in other plants where Boeing was. And there are stories that have already been written that talk to us about that's why Boeing is there. And then there are the whistleblowers who come up because, again, there needs to be people who eventually stand up and say, I've had enough of this because I can see the fact that what's happening here is going to kill people. So let's discuss that as well and the people on the inside. Here's a report from CBS which looks specifically at the whistleblowers who got involved and the people who basically sacrificed their jobs because they saw things, much like you did, that simply were going wrong every single day.
The 787 Dreamliner is Boeing's flagship airplane. American and United fly 86 of them. But CBS News has confirmed the FAA received nearly a dozen whistleblower complaints as recently as 2017, expressing concerns about the manufacturing of the Dreamliner at Boeing's South Carolina plant. The complaints, first reported by the New York Times, range from allegations of finding tools and debris inside new planes to employees facing pressure to put speed over safety.
I don't feel like the company's putting the priority into quality. It's production for profit.
Rich Mester is a former Boeing technician who spoke to the Times. He was fired last year. How often would you say you found debris inside an airliner where it shouldn't have been?
Every plane. I personally found tubes of sealant, nuts, panduits. We found clamps. They found a string of lights, work lights in the aft section of the airplane.
Boeing says the Times report paints a skewed and inaccurate picture of the 787 program with distorted information, rehashing of old stories and rumors, adding safety and quality are at the core of Boeing's values.
All right, Ross, I'm going to play devil's advocate here, and I'm going to try to be fair like I do in every single interview. Things happen. Stuff happens. Okay, there's a clamp here and there. There's an epoxy seal that's here and there. There's a couple of screws that are sitting here. Come on. This is an aircraft that has billions of moving parts, And none of this is really going to make any effect whatsoever on the aircraft because the key systems, electrical and the hydraulic systems in the aircraft, are still as safe as we can design them. That's what Boeing would say, to which you would then respond.
I would say, Mr. Boeing, you're not making a grass cutter. You're making an aircraft with people in it. It's not even a truck where if it catches fire, he can pull off the road and get the passengers off. That aircraft at 37,000 feet, the metal shavings could cause an electric failure on that airplane or a fire in the middle of the ocean. Where is that guy going to go and save those passengers? So no, I'm afraid I won't accept that. Again, it's called quality assurance. You know, as you mentioned, Boeing moved the manufacturing plant from Seattle area, Pacific Northwest, where they had amazingly productive, smart, experienced workers, engineers, pilots, instructors. They moved it out of Seattle area. They went to the Charleston, South Carolina, where they are a work to rule state, which means it's almost impossible to start a union there. Regardless of what you think about unions, in certain job areas, you need a union protection, especially as an aircraft manufacturer, as a pilot. You know, I worked for some non-union carriers, unfortunately, in between jobs from major airlines. In the old days, we would get furloughed every couple of years. And when you're working for a non-union carrier, you can't really go up to your boss and say, I'm not going to fly this airplane. I don't think it's safe. Guess what? You're out a door with no protection. One of the reasons that airlines like United, American, Delta, these guys are deemed to be the safest airlines is because of the fact that those pilots and mechanics are unionized. They know that if they turn down an aircraft, they're not going to be fired. Just like these folks, these Boeing workers, the whistleblowers that were fired with absolutely no protection from a union or anybody else.
Why don't we then, and you just brought up a good point with regard to a union, if the pilots themselves, and the pilots are the last line of defense when they strap into those cockpit chairs, if the pilot senses in any way, shape, or form that the aircraft may not be safe, should he or she simply not refuse to fly and just start shutting these airlines down and shutting these manufacturers down? Look, I get it. The nation will come to a crawl. Everything will stop, and there will be a disaster when it comes to people needing to get somewhere, and they will be angry at the pilots, no doubt. But is that not where we're at this point, where the pilots themselves need to take some action and say, I'm not flying that plane because I know there potentially could be a disaster, and I'm not going to kill 159 people?
Yes, Ed. You know, the anecdote is that we as pilots always arrive at the scene of the accident. We're first to arrive at the scene of an accident. So if we do know about these things, believe me, 90% of the pilots will not accept an unsafe aircraft.
But there are 10% who will.
There are 10% who will. They're worried about their job. They're worried about their mortgage. Their wife is in chemotherapy, whatever. Sometimes they overlook, and that's when the trouble starts. But let's face it, most Dreamliner pilots had no idea underneath in the bowels of the aircraft, there's metal shavings. There are those things that the gentleman said he discovered in those airplanes next to the wiring bundles. We do check the airplane prior to each flight. We do our walk around, but it's kind of a cursory look. We don't go in and check every wire bundle in the guts and bowels of the aircraft. So majority of the Dreamliner pilots had no idea what was going on during the manufacturing of that Dreamliner in South Carolina.
when you look at the fact that the first accident with the 737 MAX 8 happened on October 29th of 2018, and then the second one was on March 10th of 2019, we've got several months there. Is it not fair to say that after all these wonderful apologies from Boeing and others, that we need to ask, what did you know? When did you know it? And I think that the third question would be, why did you cover it up? Because, come on, they knew that there was a paragraph or paragraphs missing from the manual, and the pilots were not being trained properly. They knew that they could have had a problem here. Is it not fair to say that they knew there was a problem, they were hoping it would go away, and in essence, we're looking at corporate governance here that could be guilty of murder?
Yes, Ed. We all know that this MCAS, which I call it a Band-Aid, that instead of healing the wound, it turned into an infection. It was a Band-Aid to put on this aircraft after the test pilots flew the new version with the bigger engines. They have to complain that this airplane is not stable. That's one of the first things that a test pilot looks for, a stable aircraft. This wasn't. And then quickly they went back to the drawing board and they came up with this Band-Aid. But the worst thing is that they kept it away from the pilots. We as pilots, we're very curious. We like to know everything about our airplane. In this particular case, there was absolutely no mention in any of the pilot manuals, although this airplane is quite different from the original version.
Why would they do that, though, Ross? I mean, there seems to be an indication here in one of the reports that they believed that the MCAS explanation was in an earlier manual, but then they left it out of this manual. Why would you do something like that? There doesn't seem to be any logical reason.
Well, there is. We found out that the main reason for that was, again, going back to money. If you have a new device like this MCAS, which we've never had on previous 737s, you would have to at least inform the pilots and train them on that particular, what we call a differences course. And in this case, I would have brought all the MAX pilots in simulator and actually flown the aircraft and show them what the system does and how to get rid of it in case of a problem. But Boeing, in unison with the greedy CEOs of the airlines, they didn't want to pay for that extra day or two of training. They gave the pilots about an hour on their iPad training differences without even mentioning the MCAS. So this was in the beginning an absolute a new thing for these poor fellows in Lion Air, number one. Yes, afterwards there was some mention about it, but still, like you were saying, Boeing didn't have the decency to come out and say, all right, let's stop everything. Let's train these guys properly so they know how to handle this if it happens again.
And how much would it have cost to train these pilots?
It would have cost a little extra money because it takes, you take that pilot off the schedule, you send them, you fly them to the simulator, they fly 2 or 3 hours in the simulator. It costs perhaps, depending on the size of the airline, several $1 million for the extra training. But this could have saved 347 lives. I claim that Boeing CEO is criminally responsible for the death or the murder of these people, and they should look into it. Unfortunately, our FAA failed just as well because there was a cozy relationship between FAA and manufacturers, especially Boeing. They basically rubber stamped everything that Boeing said. You know, going back to what I said, this is not the first time Boeing has failed in something. Several years ago, there was a rudder issue with earlier models of 737. Right. In modern airplanes, we have double and triple backups. How crazy it sounds for them to come up with this brand new design that was essential to this airplane to make it stable and use only one source. If you wanted an extra AOA, angle of attack sensor, you had to pay extra for that. It'll be like you go buy a car and the salesman says, Ed, your car has basic brakes, but if you want emergency brakes, that's a little extra. This is crazy. I don't know where to go with all this greed from these folks.
You mentioned the FAA. Is it time to also admit to ourselves that the FAA is useless when it comes to really protecting the American public and simply, as you said, rubber checks most everything, rubber stamps it, and they are just as complicit when it comes down to issues such as this as manufacturers such as Boeing? Is that fair to say?
That is very fair to say, Ed. FAA has been definitely complicit in this particular issue. Now, the rest of the world looked up to us. Everything that FAA did, the rest of the world followed. If we notice, with the grounding of these airplanes, we were the last. Chinese started first to ground these airplanes. Other countries, FAA was the last one to stick with Boeing, and they were forced, they were shamed into eventually ground these airplanes.
You had to be shaking your head at that news.
I was. I couldn't believe it. This was a FAA that the rest of the world looked up to. No, this was definitely shameful.
What's it going to take, Ross? We've talked about a couple of things: going after the FAA, going after Boeing. We've talked about trying to make things safer. We've talked about the fact that the American public themselves, quite frankly, needs to be a little bit scared when they get into an airliner right now. We don't want to sit here and scare people, but we're just trying to give them the facts. What is it going to take? Because we all know how slowly things work in government and things work at big business. It would seem like 5 years from now, and maybe a few thousand more deaths, we'll still be talking about this.
Well, sadly, all the safety books in airlines in the air are written in blood. We learned from our mistakes in the past. I'm hoping that the pressure from public, and in this particular case, everybody, unless if you are living under a rock, have heard about this. And because of the social media, because of the news that we see and hear on TV, most people have heard about this, and majority of them are extremely upset. And therefore, let's hope they put some pressure on our legislators for them to get off their butts and do something about this. You have to make somebody accountable. In certain countries around the world, in Japan years ago, there was an accident on Japan Airlines. The CEO went and threw himself in front of the subway and killed himself. We need to make these people accountable for their decisions in the boardroom. You can't continue with greed, total greed, that they've been operating in Chicago since they moved the board of directors and all the managers over to Chicago, away from where they make these airplanes in Seattle.
Ross, it's been an absolute pleasure to have you on the show. I want to thank you very much for your time. I want to remind everybody that aeroconsultingexperts.com, that's Ross's group. These are the guys who know exactly what's happening in the air, and it's wonderful that they have the opportunity to talk with us. Twitter also is at 787PIC. You folks want to follow it there. Ross, again, thank you so much for your time. I hope we talk again soon.
It was a pleasure, Ed. Thank you, sir.
All right, let's remind everybody, and we've been flashing that throughout the show here, for those of you watching on the video side, for those of you listening on the audio side, let's remind you of a couple of things. You can email us at maninthearena@edberliner.com. Also, social media is at Berliner Speaks. That's Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Send us your messages there. Podcast platforms that we are heard on. The audio of every show is heard on iTunes, Google Play Music, TuneIn, Radio Public, and Spreaker. I recommend CastBox for Android, and all the video and audio you can also catch at edberliner.com. If you don't want to go through all that, you can catch it and you can download it there. Thank you so much for joining us, everybody. And until next time here on The Man in the Arena, I'm Ed Berliner. Rock on, true believers.